The north is cold and full of whispers.
Jon woke in the dark with cold sweat on his chest and a name dissolving on his tongue. Not his own name. Something older. Something the dream had given him and was already taking back. He lay still. The fire in his room had burned to ash. The window showed nothing. Not stars, not moon. Just gray-black, and the sound of the wind finding gaps in the stone. Ghost was gone. The wolf's blanket in the corner still held the shape of him, that loose arrangement of weight and breath Jon had learned to read in the dark the way some men read weather. The indent was there. Ghost wasn't. Jon dressed without a candle. He knew the room by touch, the cold iron of the door handle, the stone threshold 2 fingers' width lower than the floor. The corridor outside turning left toward the stairs and right toward the inner ward. He chose left. Toward the crypts. He didn't know why. The corridor smelled of rushes and tallow, and the particular dead air of a castle at the 3rd hour of night, when even the servants who worked before dawn were still sleeping. His boots on stone. His breath in the dark. Nothing else. The crypts were colder than the rest of Winterfell. That was usual. The air changed at the top of the steps, dropped 3 degrees in the space of a single stride, the way air dropped when you stepped from a firelit hall into the courtyard. Jon had come here enough times to stop noticing it. He noticed it tonight. Not because it changed. Because it didn't. The upper crypts were carved from the living rock beneath Winterfell, torchlit at intervals by sconces that Luwin had burned a standing argument with Ned about. 3 of the torches had gone out. Jon stood in the remaining light and looked at what the shadows covered. A door he had never seen open had been pushed open from the inside. Not burst. Pushed. The latch hadn't broken. The latch was on the ground 3 feet from the door, clean from the hinge, as if someone had applied steady and deliberate force. The door itself hung ajar into a space Jon had always understood, in the unexamined way a boy understood his own house, to be solid stone. It wasn't solid stone. The passage beyond was narrow. Old, the walls hadn't been dressed, rough quarried, the tool marks still in the surface, the kind of work that predated Winterfell's castellan by generations. The air coming through it wasn't cold. It was warm. Jon pressed his hand to the stone of the door frame and held it there. The warmth wasn't fire, it was even. Constant, it came from below. Rising through the rock the way heat rose through summer soil. Not fire, something older than fire, Ghost's tracks in the dust of the threshold. Unmistakable, the passage sloped down gently at first, then steep enough that Jon had to press one hand to the wall for balance. The warmth increased with every 10 steps. By the time the passage leveled, he was sweating through his shirt. The air had no damp in it. That was the wrong thing. The impossible thing. Rock at this depth should sweat. The crypts above sweated. This passage was dry as bone. The passage ended. Not in a wall. In a door. Jon stopped. The left half was weirwood, pale as cream, the grain running straight and tight, the carved face looking out with the expression all weirwood faces had. Which was not peace exactly, not fury exactly. Watching, the right half was something darker, close-grained and dense in a way that made the air feel heavier near it, ironwood, the kind they used for shield backing, the kind that took an axe 3 times what it should. No handle. No visible hinge from this side. At chest height, pressed into the weirwood face, a handprint. 5 fingers, adult-sized, the lines of a palm worn smooth by 1,000 years of no contact. Around it, in a spiral extending outward to the edges of the panel, runes. Jon had learned letters from Maester Luwin. He had learned standard rune script, organized and formal, and he was adequate at it, and no better. These were not those runes. He knew them anyway. Not with his mind. Not with memory. With something underneath memory. Something that recognized the shapes the way a hand recognized the grip of a familiar sword in the dark. His eyes moved across the spiral, and something in his chest moved with them. And it wasn't comfortable. And it wasn't warm. And it was the feeling of a word in a language you forgot you knew. Ghost sat in front of the door, perfectly still, not watching the door, watching Jon. Jon pressed his hand against the carved print. A splinter drove into the meat of his palm. He pulled back. His hand came away with a thin line of red across the heel. Nothing serious, the kind of cut a cold morning's firewood left. The runes pulsed. Not light. Warmth. The kind that moved. That traveled outward from his handprint through the carved spiral and into the ironwood and back again, a circuit completing itself. The door didn't open outward. It folded. Both panels, weirwood and ironwood, simply ceased to be in front of him. Not disintegrated, not dissolved, absorbed into themselves, into the frame, as if they had never been designed as barriers, only as closures. And what they closed was now ready to be opened. The mechanism was older than anything Jon had a name for. He stood in the entrance and felt the air of the space beyond move over him, and it smelled like nothing. Not stone, not damp, not wood smoke, not the iron smell of old weapons, or the wax smell of candles, or the slow decay that everything accumulated over time. Nothing. Like a room that had never needed to smell like anything, because nothing inside it had ever changed. Jon took one step. Then another. The chamber was vast, out of all proportion to the passage leading to it. 3 times the size of Winterfell's great hall above, at minimum. The walls were lined with fitted shelves, cut directly into the rock and on the shelves. Row upon uniform row, bronze scroll cases, each sealed with a disc of wax and a rune stamp pressed into it. Hundreds of them. More than hundreds. He stopped counting. Between the shelves, mounted flat against the stone, weirwood tablets. Not small, the size of table slabs, some larger, pale and carved with text so dense the individual characters were barely larger than his thumbnail. The same runes from the door, wall after wall of them. In the center of the chamber, a stone table. On the table, inlaid in bronze, a map. Jon walked to it slowly. He knew maps. Luwin had taught him the 7 kingdoms, the free cities, the coastlines that mattered. He knew where the neck sat, where the bite cut in, where the broken arm of Dorne reached east toward Essos. The map on the table showed none of that. It showed what had been there before, the arm of Dorne unbroken, curving east in an unbroken reach. A coastline in the south that no longer existed, before whatever the children had destroyed had changed the shape of the world entirely. A Westeros that no living person had ever seen, because the last person who saw it had been dead for 10,000 years. Jon put his finger to the eastern arm and traced it west, following the drowned coastline of a continent that no longer was. Then he ran for Ned. He didn't explain it in the corridor. He didn't explain it on the stairs. He stood outside his father's door and said 2 words, "Come now," in a voice that came out level, which surprised him. Because his heart was going at a pace that should have made it shake. Ned came. He wore a robe, unlaced, no sword. He read Jon's face the way Jon had seen him read scouting reports, quick and complete, without asking for confirmation of what it was telling him. He followed without a word. They went back down together, through the passage, into the warmth. Jon stood aside at the entrance and let Ned walk through first. Ned stopped inside the threshold. He didn't speak for a long time. He moved to the nearest shelf and lifted one of the bronze scroll cases, carefully, both hands, the way you lifted something you suspected might break, and suspected you could never replace. He looked at the rune stamp on the wax seal. His lips moved, soundlessly, and then stopped. His hands, Jon noticed, had been shaking when he lifted the case. They stopped shaking. He looked at the tablets on the wall. He looked at the scroll cases ranked in their hundreds. He looked at the central table and the map of the world that no longer existed. "Your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather didn't know this was here," Ned said. His voice was very quiet, not awed exactly. Something deeper than awe, something awe became when it ran long enough. "No Stark has known this was here, not for 1,000 years." He set the scroll case down. He looked at Jon. "You opened the door." Jon held up his palm. The cut was already drying, thin, clean, already less than it had looked. Ned looked at the cut. Then he looked back at the room. He pulled a scroll case from the shelf, sat down on the stone floor with it across his lap, his back to the shelves, and began to turn it over in his hands, reading the exterior rune stamp from every angle. Processing, going somewhere Jon couldn't follow yet. Jon sat down beside him. Ghost moved between them and lowered himself onto the stone with the particular deliberateness of a wolf who had decided a location was satisfactory and intended to stay there. The three of them sat in a room that hadn't been breathed in for 1,000 years. The only sound was the faint, constant warmth rising through the rock from the springs below, and the near-silent sound of Ned Stark's breathing as he read the same rune stamp 6, 7, 8 times. Jon looked at the map on the central table from where he sat. The drowned coastline. The continent before the breaking. His finger had left a faint mark on the eastern arm where he'd traced it, a skin oil smudge on bronze that had seen no contact for 10 millennia. The shape of a world that was gone. Preserved in perfect, airless dark. He didn't know yet what it had been waiting for. He watched Luwin's face. That was all Ned did, standing 3 steps inside the chamber, arms folded, torch in his left hand. He had not explained what he'd found. He'd sent the raven before dawn, 2 words on the slip, come, now. He'd stood at the library entrance and waited for the maester to arrive, and when Luwin ducked through the passage and straightened and stopped, when his eyes found the shelves and his mouth opened and his chain swung forward as he leaned involuntarily toward the nearest bronze case, that was the moment Ned had been measuring against, privately, since before he slept. He needed to know if what he was seeing was real. Luwin's chain rattled. He didn't notice it rattle. He was already moving, not toward Ned, not looking for permission. Toward the tablets on the wall, hand outstretched, one finger tracing a line of runes without touching them, the way a man traced something he was afraid to smear. Old tongue, Luwin said. His voice had gone very flat and very precise, the voice he used when something required his complete, undivided accuracy. The top register is Old Tongue. Pre-Reformation script. The letter forms are... He stopped. His finger had reached the middle register. He leaned closer. The candlelight caught the gray in his hair. That's not Old Tongue. No, Ned said. This is. Luwin's hand dropped. He turned. He looked at Ned directly for the first time since entering the chamber. Lord Stark. How long has this been here? I don't know. Who else has been inside? Jon, Ghost found the passage. Luwin absorbed that. He turned back to the wall. His finger moved to the lowest register, below the Old Tongue, below the middle runes, and stopped completely. What was there wasn't characters in any meaningful sense. They were shapes that wanted to be characters. Concepts pressed into weirwood, rather than described in any alphabet Luwin's considerable education had prepared him for. He stepped back. I'll need time, he said. You have it, Ned said. The raven to the neck took 3 days to arrive. Howland Reed arrived 11 days after that, which was faster than the distance should have allowed. He came with 2 crannogmen and no banners, flat-bottomed boat up the White Knife, then horse for the last 30 miles. He was mud-spattered and smelled of the bogs, and when he entered Winterfell's yard, his eyes went immediately to the keep and stayed there. Not on Ned's face, not on the walls. On the keep itself, as if he already knew something was different about its interior, like a man who had been waiting for this. Ned didn't speak in the yard. He led Howland through the castle and down the passage without preamble. Howland followed without asking. He ducked through the library door, stepped inside, and straightened. He walked to the central table, not to the shelves, not to the tablets on the wall, to the map. He stood over it with his hands at his sides. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled, the breath of a man releasing something he had been carrying for a very long time. I've seen this map, Howland said, on the Isle of Faces. The green men showed it to me when I was 17. Ned stared at him. I thought it was a dream, Howland said. He turned. His face was, as it always was, difficult to read, still water over uncertain depth. I went to the Isle before the war. You know that. I've never said what I saw there. 17 years you've never said. There was nothing to say it against. Howland put his hand on the edge of the table, touching the raised coastline of the eastern arm with one finger. It wasn't a dream then, No, Ned said. It wasn't. They worked in shifts after that. Lewin on the old tongue, he was adequate, improving daily, the texts dense but not beyond him. Howland on the lowest register, the pact language, which he translated less by reading than by remembering, a slow process he couldn't fully explain and didn't try to. And John worked on the middle register. The first men, runes. Ned had handed the boy a tablet on the third day, meaning to show him the shape of the problem, how the layers stacked, what they were working toward. John had looked at the tablet for approximately 12 seconds. Then he had begun to translate. Not slowly, not haltingly, the way a man translated something he already knew. Ned didn't say anything. John didn't say anything. He set the tablet down and picked up a stylus and began to copy his translation onto a clean slate, and his hand didn't hesitate once. Ned watched him for a moment, then went back to his own section of wall. Later, when they were alone, he would ask. Not yet. The Song of Ice tablets were mounted separately from the rest, physically apart, higher on the wall. The carving noticeably deeper than anything else in the chamber. Someone had worked harder on these. Someone had understood that these words, specifically, should not be easily damaged or defaced. Ned read Lewin's translation standing at the table, the slate in both hands. A prince of two bloods, born of ice and fire, who will wake the stone dragon and stand at the wall's first breaking. He read it again. He set the slate down. He looked across the chamber at John. John was deep in the middle register of a scroll case, back turned, not paying attention. Ned looked at the shape of the boy's jaw and profile, the gray of his eyes where they caught the candlelight. He looked away. He went back to his section of wall and translated for another hour without stopping. The Night's King's record was Howland's find. He brought it to Ned late on the 9th day, the slate balanced in both hands, his face arranged around something that had no clean name. The account of the kneeling commander, Howland said. He set it on the table. The library calls it that. It didn't give a family name. It gave 3 officers, personal runes, which the library listed in a cross-reference appendix against the Night's Watch's founding roles. The commander himself appeared only as a title, the man who kneeled, in the pact language, 3 men who had served him. Their runes. Lewin recognized one of them. He went very still. He set his own stylus down and looked at the rune for a long moment without speaking. "Which house?" Ned said. Lewin picked the stylus back up. He didn't look at Ned. "If this translation is accurate, and I believe it is, this will break something that cannot be rebuilt." He paused. "I'd like to be certain before I name the house. Lord Stark, give me 2 more days on the cross-reference." Ned looked at him. Lewin had been maester in Winterfell for 23 years. He was not given to drama. If he wanted 2 more days, it was because the name required certainty. 2 days, Ned said. They found Winterfell's purpose on the 11th night, not in the tablets, in the engineering diagrams mounted along the rear wall, which none of them had closely examined, because they appeared, at first assessment, to be unlabeled architectural drawings of no particular significance. Ned looked at them on the 11th night because he couldn't sleep, and there was nothing else in the chamber he hadn't already read 3 times. They weren't architectural drawings, flow diagrams. The hot springs, the channels that ran beneath Winterfell's floors and through its walls, were not where they were by accident or convenience. The diagrams showed them redirected. Deliberately and precisely, over what the notation suggested had been a decade of construction work, redirected into a configuration centered on a chamber the diagrams labeled, in the old tongue, as the furnace. Not a hearth. A forge. A forge calibrated to a temperature that Lewin spent 20 minutes converting into units he recognized, and then went quiet for a long time after the conversion was complete. "That's not possible," Lewin said. "That temperature requires..." "Dragonfire," Howland said. He'd been reading over Lewin's shoulder. "Or its equivalent." Lewin looked at the diagrams again. The springs run at approximately the correct mineral composition. If the channels were restored to this configuration, he stopped himself. If Bran the Builder designed this specifically, he stopped again. He started from the beginning. Winterfell was not built as a castle. "No," Ned said. He looked at the diagram. The redirected channels, the precise and ancient engineering of a man who had understood, 10,000 years ago, that there would come a day when the North would need to make things that couldn't be made anywhere else. He hadn't stumbled onto the springs, he'd built the castle around them. In that order. The forge first, then the fortress to protect it. The castle was secondary. It had always been secondary. They stood at the central table at midnight. Lewin had gone to sleep 2 hours ago. Ned had made him go. He looked 15 years older than he had the morning before the library opened. Howland said, when Robert arrives, "What will you tell him?" Ned looked at the map. The drowned coastline. The arm of Dorne unbroken and curving east into a sea that had remade itself. He looked at it for a long time. "Nothing," he said. He picked up his candle and walked back toward the stairs. His footsteps faded up the passage and then stopped. And then the silence of the library settled back into place the way water settled after a stone was lifted from it. Howland stayed. He put both hands flat on the surface of the table, over the map, over the ancient bronze. He closed his eyes. His lips moved without sound, not slowly, not hesitantly. The way lips moved when a man was speaking words he had known for a long time in a language he learned in a dream and spent 17 years pretending to forget. She saw it before Robert did. That was usually how it worked. The gates of Winterfell were open when the procession crested the last rise. Open and waiting, the household staff assembled in the yard in their ranks. The Stark bannermen posted along the walls. Standard reception. Everything correct and in its place. Cersei looked at it through the wheelhouse window with the particular kind of attention she had spent 30 years developing. The kind that didn't look like attention at all, that looked like boredom if you weren't watching for it. Something was wrong with Eddard Stark. Not wrong. Different. She didn't have the word for it yet, which irritated her more than the difference itself, because she always had words. He stood at the head of his household in the yard, Lady Stark beside him, the children behind them in their order. Correct positioning. Correct dress. His face wore the expression she associated with him, grave, deliberate. The expression of a man who took everything seriously because he lacked the imagination to take anything lightly. She had never liked him. She had always found him useful. Because men, like Ned Stark, were predictable, and predictable men could be managed. He was looking at the procession the way men looked at weather, assessing it, not braced for it, not arranging his face against it. He was not waiting for Robert, he was watching the procession arrive, and the distinction was not subtle once you saw it. Cersei leaned back from the window. Robert embraced him in the yard with the full force of a man who had spent 6 weeks in a wheelhouse and was grateful for a shoulder to grip. Ned absorbed it. She watched his feet, his footing adjusted automatically. A man who had fought and hunted and knew how to take weight without advertising the adjustment. The courtyard was cold. The children were presented. She watched Joffrey watch the Stark girls, which required its own careful management later. Robert said something to Ned that she couldn't hear from her position, and Ned replied, and Robert laughed. And Ned's face did what it always did. Nothing. Exactly, but different now. The nothing was not the nothing of a man containing himself. It was the nothing of a man who didn't need to contain anything, because he had already sorted the relevant questions and reached the relevant conclusions, and Robert's laugh didn't touch any of them. She smiled at Lady Stark. Lady Stark smiled back. They understood each other perfectly, which meant they understood each other not at all. Robert wanted the crypts. That was the first test, the old one, the ritual one, Lyanna's tomb. He had done this every time, Cersei understood, though this was her first time north. He went to the tomb the way some men went to the sept, the way her father went to the account books, the way Tyrion went to the wine. Repetition that was also confession. She didn't follow them down. She stood in the upper yard and watched the entrance to the crypts close behind Robert's torch and Ned's torch, and she counted the minutes. They were down there longer than they should have been. When they came back up, Robert's face was the face he wore after an argument he hadn't quite won. Not losing, Robert did not lose arguments, he simply tired of them and moved the terrain. But not winning either. He was talking too loudly about the feast, about the ale he'd been promised, about wanting to see the yard properly in daylight. covering something. Ned's face was the same face it had been in the yard. Still, already somewhere else. She filed that away. In the great hall that evening, the torches were high and the fire was banked, and the northern ale was, as advertised, considerably better than its reputation. Robert was in his element, loud, generous, the center of every table he looked at. Cersei sat where she was required to sit, and said the things required of her, and watched. The refusal came between the second and third courses. Ned didn't announce it. He didn't stand. He was speaking to Robert at the high table, quietly, directly, and Cersei was 6 seats away and she still heard every word, because the hall had one of those acoustic accidents that very old stone produced, and she had positioned herself deliberately near it. "I'm needed here," Ned said. Robert's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "Ned, the watch is bleeding men without replenishment. Something is moving in the forest beyond the wall, and the garrison at Castle Black is at 1/3 of what it requires. The management of this hold requires— I didn't come 1,500 miles to hear you talk about the wall." Robert set his cup down. Not hard. Robert was careful about things in public, when he remembered to be. "Jon Arryn is dead, Ned. I need a hand I can trust." "I know," Ned said, "and I'm sorry for it, but the North needs a lord who is present, and the Watch needs a lord who advocates for it, and I cannot do either from King's Landing." Robert looked at him. Cersei watched Robert look at him, watched her husband read Ned's face for the negotiating position behind the stated position, the price. The real number, the thing Ned actually wanted in exchange for this objection. Robert had been doing that calculation since he was a boy. He was very good at it. His face changed when he couldn't find anything. There was no price. Ned wasn't opening a negotiation. He was stating a position he had reached before Robert arrived, and he was prepared to state it as many times as required at whatever volume Robert chose. Robert tried volume. Not at the table. He wasn't entirely without sense, but in the solar after, when the feast had moved past its peak, and they could absent themselves without ceremony. Cersei was not invited into the solar. She stood in the corridor outside it, and heard Robert's voice do what it did when it hit something immovable, rising steadily through registers, until it became less a voice than a condition of the air. Ned's voice was audible twice, the same words, spaced roughly 5 minutes apart, quieter the second time than the first. When the solar door opened, Robert came out first. His face was arranged around something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. He walked past Cersei without acknowledging her, which meant he knew she'd been there, and didn't care. She let him get 3 steps ahead before she followed. She looked into the solar as she passed. Ned was standing at the window. The shutters were open onto the inner yard, cold air coming through. The yard below showing torchlight and the shadows of the night watch moving along the walls. He wasn't watching any of it. He was looking at the wall itself, the stone, in the particular way a man looked at something that confirmed what he already knew. He heard her. He turned. She held his gaze for a moment, one professional assessment to another, the only honest transaction they'd ever conducted. She smiled, the smile that didn't come from anything. He didn't produce a smile in return. He simply looked at her, and then he looked back at the yard, and she moved on down the corridor. In her chambers, she sent her ladies away. She sat at the writing table, the candle close, the parchment unrolled. Her hand moved to the top of the page. She wrote the word Lannister and looked at it. She thought about the solar and Ned's voice saying the same words twice and quieter the second time, not because Robert's volume had intimidated him into softening, because he'd realized the volume wasn't the point and hadn't needed to match it. She drew a line through the word. She wrote her father's name. Then she sat for a long time with the quill above the page, considering what to tell him and what to leave out, and what, specifically about the last 6 hours, had made her feel the way she felt when her father told her she was going to marry Robert Baratheon. Not the fear, she managed fear easily, but the specific quality of the fear. The kind that came from recognizing that something was already in motion and had been in motion for longer than you had known to watch for it. She wrote for a long time. The candle burned lower. She folded the letter. She pressed her seal into the wax. She looked at her father's name on the front. Somewhere in the castle below, a door closed. She didn't know which door. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that it was Ned Stark returning to wherever he went when the public part of his day was finished. The sound of a man who had somewhere specific to be, and knew exactly what waited for him there. She set the letter aside. She was going to need to find out what was in the crypts. Ned told her in the morning, before the castle woke. He came to her solar with no preamble, no knock, the door opening the way it opened when he had already decided the conversation was happening, and the only remaining question was when. She was at the window with her sewing, the early light thin and gray across the yard below. She heard the door and didn't turn. She knew his step. He said, "John won't go to the wall." The needle stopped. She set the fabric in her lap and looked at the window for a moment, the yard below, the smoke from the kitchen starting, one of the stable boys moving across the frozen ground in the careful way of someone who had fallen on it before. She turned around. His face was the face he'd been wearing for 2 weeks now, the one she didn't have a name for yet. She knew every face Ned Stark owned. She had catalogued them across 15 years of marriage the way a general catalogued terrain. The face of guilt, the face of grief, the face of love he couldn't articulate, the face of duty when duty cost him something. This face wasn't any of those. This was a man who had stopped bracing for the next thing and started choosing it. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at him. "Every lord in the north will say you've lost your mind." "No," Ned said. "They'll say I invoked the right of the old king." The room was very quiet. From somewhere below came the muffled sound of the kitchen fires being built up, the clang of iron, the ordinary morning sounds of a castle that didn't know anything had changed. "I don't know that right," Catelyn said. Her voice came out level and precise, which was what her voice did when she was being most careful. "Neither does anyone else. Not anymore." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands open, which was how he held himself when he was telling the truth and wanted her to see him telling it. "The library has the original northern law. Preamble. Before the faith brought its ideas about lineage and bastardry and who belonged to which house under which god's authority." He paused. Under First Men law, bastardry as a category didn't exist. A lord of First Men blood could declare any child of First Men blood a blood child of his house, through a ceremony, before a heart tree. Catelyn looked at him. "Bastardry," Ned said, "was an Andal import. We adopted it because we adopted everything else. But the North never swore to the faith. We swear to the old gods. Under the old law, I am not circumventing anything. I am restoring it." She was quiet for a moment. She had 3 questions, and she asked them in the order of their importance, which was the reverse of the order he would expect. "What does this mean for Robb's inheritance?" "Nothing. Robb is firstborn and trueborn. That doesn't change. For the girls? Nothing. Does Jon inherit ahead of Robb under this law? At any point. Under any circumstance." Ned looked at her steadily. No, she held the look. 15 years had taught her the difference between Ned Stark telling her what she wanted to hear and Ned Stark telling her the truth. The difference was small and consistent, and she had never once been wrong about it. He was telling her the truth. She looked at the window again. The stable boy had reached the far side of the yard. "Then why?" she said. Not a question exactly. An opening. Ned said, "Because I need him here, Cat, not at the wall. Here with everything I now know he can do." What can he do? He didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. He couldn't tell her everything. She understood that from his face, not as evasion, but as the genuine weight of something he hadn't finished understanding himself. He was asking her to trust him across a gap he couldn't yet bridge with words. She had done that before. It had cost her before. "Jon," she said, "has been a wound in this marriage since the day you brought him home." "I know. I have never asked you who his mother was." "I know that too. I'm asking now." The room held the question. Ned looked at his hands, open on his knees, the old scars from the ranging years, the one across the right palm she had traced in the dark 100 times. His hands closed. "Not yet," he said. Not because I won't. Because the answer changes things. I need you to be steady for first. She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the grate settled, a log shifting, a brief collapse of ember. She picked her sewing back up, not because she intended to sew, because it gave her hands something to do that wasn't showing him what her hands wanted to do. The ceremony, she said. When? Dawn? Tomorrow? Who attends? Howland? No one else. She nodded once. That was all. He stood. He was at the door when she said, Ned. He stopped. If this is wrong, she said, you will not be able to undo it. Whatever this is, whatever is in that library, once you move this piece, it doesn't go back. I know, he said. Then know it completely, she said. Not mostly. He left. She sat with her sewing in her lap and looked at the door for a while after it closed. Dawn came gray and still. She didn't go to the godswood. She stood at her solar window and looked at the direction of it, the dark mass of the old trees visible above the inner walls, the bare branches of the heart tree just distinguishable from the others by the pale of its bark. 3 figures crossed the yard below her window in the early dark. Ned and John and Howland Reed, no torches, moving quietly across the frozen ground. John was taller than she had registered recently. He had Ned's walk, the same economic straightness, weight forward, the walk of someone who expected the ground to be uneven and had stopped thinking about it. He was 15 years old, and he moved like a man who had already decided what kind of man he was going to be. She watched until the godswood swallowed them. Then, she turned away. She found Sansa by mid-morning. Her eldest daughter was in the weaving room with her septa, nominally at her needlework, actually at the window that faced the king's party's temporary stables. Watching Joffrey's squire exercise a horse in the outer yard, her chin on her hand, her work untouched in her lap. Catelyn sat beside her. Sansa straightened immediately. She had her father's conscience about being caught at something. Mother, I can see what you were doing, Catelyn said. Not unkindly. Sansa folded her hands over her needlework. She was 12 years old, and already arranging her face the way Catelyn had taught her, composed, pleasant, informative of nothing. She was good at it. Better than Catelyn had expected her to be yet. Something is happening, Sansa said. It wasn't a question. She had her mother's eye for when the household's atmosphere had shifted, even if she didn't yet have the vocabulary to name what she was reading. With Jon. Your father is making a decision about Jon. Yes, Sansa processed that. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking, instead of when she was waiting to speak. Catelyn watched it, and felt something move in her chest, the shape of her own mind in a younger face, still unguarded, still visibly working. Joffrey said last night that Jon would be going to the wall, Sansa said carefully. He said it about Jon specifically. I think he meant it to be, she paused, choosing her word. You don't have to soften it, Catelyn said. Unkind, Sansa said. I think he meant it to be unkind. To Jon. Catelyn looked at her daughter. She looked at the yard beyond the window where the squire was working the horse through its paces, patient and repetitive, and thought about what it meant that her 12-year-old daughter was already reading Joffrey Baratheon correctly. Joffrey is wrong, Catelyn said. Jon is staying. Sansa absorbed that. She turned it over. Catelyn could see her doing it. Running the implications forward the way Catelyn had taught her to run them, what it meant for the household, what it meant for Joffrey's assumptions, what it meant for everything that had been arranged in her head about what the future looked like. Does Jon know? Sansa asked. He knows. Sansa was quiet again. Then, what is father doing? In the library. He goes every night. Catelyn looked at the yard. The squire had stopped the horse at the far wall, letting it breathe, standing with a hand on its neck. The horse stood with its head down in the cold, patient. Your father has remembered something very old, she said. Sansa waited for more. There wasn't more. Catelyn's voice had done something when she said it, not wavered, not broken, nothing as legible as that. A quality of sound that wasn't certainty and wasn't uncertainty, but lived precisely in the space between them, in the place a person stood when they were deciding whether what they were watching was the beginning of something good or the beginning of something they would not be able to stop. She hadn't decided yet. Outside, the horse lifted its head, steam from its breath in the cold air. The squire took the reins and they walked together back toward the stables, and the yard was empty, and the godswood was quiet, and somewhere in the direction of the heart tree, Ned Stark was speaking words that no one alive had spoken for 1,000 years to a boy who could apparently hear them. Catelyn picked up Sansa's needlework and handed it to her. "Finish your work," she said. "Tonight will be complicated." The first channel opened on the 4th day of the 3rd week. Jon knew because Luwin had marked the days on a slate and estimated the channel work would be complete by the end of that week, and Luwin was almost never right about timelines. He was right about this one, which meant he had understood the engineering better than he let on. The temperature in the forge tripled in approximately 4 minutes. No coal added, no wood. The forge fire sat at its normal banking level, 2 logs and a peat brick, the kind of low heat that kept the forge from cooling completely between uses. Then the channel valve opened, a stone plug, shaped and fitted to tolerances that shouldn't have been achievable with the tools available at the time. Seated in a socket that hadn't moved in 4,000 years. It moved now. The geothermal heat came up through the floor, and the temperature gauge Luwin had borrowed from the castle's still room climbed past its upper marking and kept going. Mikken stood back from the forge and looked at it. He was not a man who showed much. Winterfell's smith for 20 years, broad through the chest and narrow through the eyes, with the particular silence of a man who had learned early that speaking cost more than it returned. He had accepted the library's existence without comment when Ned told him. He had accepted the engineering diagrams without comment. He had accepted Jon's presence at the forge, which was the most unexpected development of the 3, and he had done that without comment either. He looked at the gauge for a long time. "Right," he said, and went back to work. The runic bronze was a 3-stage problem. Mikken handled the first stage alone. The remelting. Existing bronze from the castle stores, inferior work, mismatched alloy, the kind accumulated over decades of practical need, rather than deliberate curation. In the geothermal forge it came to temperature faster than anything Mikken had seen in 20 years of smithing, and the impurities rose to the surface and skimmed cleanly in a fraction of the time normal smelting required. The resulting metal poured like something that had already decided what it wanted to be. The second stage was Jon's. The clay molds, pauldrons, blades, arrowheads, clasps, the catalog the library's armory section called the small arsenal of a prepared house had to be prepared before pouring. The runes carved into the clay before the metal went in. So the shapes were pressed into the casting as it cooled rather than inscribed afterward. The library was specific about this. The inscription had to be part of the object. Inside the metal, not on it. Jon carved the runes the way he translated them, not by remembering, by knowing. His hands knew where to go. He worked the clay molds in the evenings with the forge banked low. The single torch he'd stopped needing after the first week because the glow from the channel grate was enough. The third stage neither of them had anticipated. The words, spoken during cooling. The library was specific here too. The old First Men words, said aloud while the metal went from liquid to solid, the way a smith spoke the names of alloy components during a pour as a matter of craft habit. Except these words were older than craft habit. They were doing something the habit was only an echo of. Jon spoke them. The metal went in. He spoke the words. The mold cooled. Mikken didn't ask where the words came from. He stood back while Jon spoke them, arms folded, watching the metal with the expression of a man watching something he had no professional framework for, and was choosing not to develop one. The pauldron came out of the mold the color of amber held against firelight. Not bronze. Bronze was bright and tended gold. This was darker, the color of something that had absorbed heat rather than reflected it. The runes in the surface were slightly recessed rather than raised, and they didn't catch the forge light the way cast metal caught it. They held it. Jon handed it to Mikken. Mikken took it in both hands. He turned it over. He tapped it with his knuckle, a habit, reading resonance. His eyebrows moved a fraction. He set it on the anvil and picked up a piece of castle forged steel. A good piece, one of the castle's own production from a year ago, as good as anything made this far north. He brought the edge down on the pauldron's crown. The sound it made was wrong. Not the ring of metal on metal, something shorter. Stopped, Mikken lifted the steel away. He looked at the striking edge. The pauldron had not dented. The steel had. He set the steel piece down on the workbench. He stood with his back to Jon, very still, looking at the pauldron on the anvil. Then he picked it up again and ran his thumb across one of the recessed runes. "That's not right," Mikken said. "No," Jon said. "It isn't." The Northern Lords came in ones and twos over the following week. No banners. They stabled their own horses and wore the faces of men who had received ravens vague enough to require attendance and specific enough to preclude refusal. Mormont came first. Stone-faced, saying nothing until he'd seen what Ned had to show. The Umber envoy arrived the second day, and Great Jon himself the morning after, which meant the raven had reached him while he was already riding. Flint and Little came together. Manderly sent a man he trusted with his life, which meant the man knew everything Manderly knew and was authorized to commit as fully. Ned didn't show them the library. He showed them one thing: a blade on a table in the forge room. Amber dark, the runes recessed into both faces. Beside it, a castle-forged steel axe. He let the Umber pick up the axe. Great Jon Umber was the largest man in the north and the second largest in the room after his own axe. He swung it at the blade with approximately half his strength, enough to have taken a finger off a normal bronze blade and folded it in two. The axe bounced. The blade didn't move. Umber looked at the axe in his hand. He looked at the blade. He looked at Ned. "There is a war coming," Ned said, "that has nothing to do with the Iron Throne. And for this war, we are now the only army in the world that is equipped." Nobody spoke. Mormont picked up the blade. He held it the way old soldiers held things, not with admiration, with assessment. He turned it once. Set it back down. "How many?" he said. "Enough," Ned said. "By spring." Howland Reed taught Jon to fight in the pre-dawn dark of the inner yard, in the hour before the morning watch changed. Not what Jon had been taught before, not the Andal method, the squared stance and the high guard, and the knight's vocabulary of named strikes and countermoves. The First Men method had no names for the strikes. It had positions relative to terrain, relative to wind, relative to where the enemy's weight was committed before the enemy knew their weight was committed. It was less. It was considerably more. Jon's first lesson was standing in the yard for an hour without moving, just feeling where the wind came from and what it would do to footing in a bladed exchange. He found it humiliating. He didn't say so. Howland didn't explain why he was doing it. He stood beside Jon in the dark and was very still, and after an hour he said, "You feel it now." It wasn't a question. Jon did feel it. He didn't know what to do with what he felt yet, but the feeling was there, and it didn't go away. By the third week he was winning 1 spar in 3 against Howland, which Howland said was too fast. Jon didn't argue. By the 4th week, he sparred with Robb. Robb was better than Jon with a sword. He was always going to be better with a sword. He had 2 inches, a year of age, and the kind of natural aggression that responded well to Andal training. He came at Jon the way he always came. Direct, committed, expecting Jon to fight the same fight they'd been fighting for years. Jon didn't. He let Robb commit. He moved laterally, into the wind rather than across it. His foot found the patch of ice behind Robb's back heel. He'd placed himself there before the exchange started, before Robb had seen it as relevant, before Robb had any reason to think about what the yard surface was doing 2 steps behind his current position. 1 redirect. Robb's weight was committed left. His foot found nothing. The fight lasted 40 seconds. Robb sat on the frozen ground and looked up at Jon with an expression that was half outrage and half something else, something more honest, the look a person wore when the rules of something familiar had quietly been replaced. "That's not how you fight," Robb said. "I know," Jon said. He put his hand out. Robb took it. He stood. He looked at Jon for a moment, at his brother, who was not his brother and was, who had always been slightly other and was now other in a way that had no comfortable name yet. Again, Robb said. At midnight, Jon stood in the forge alone. The channel was banked low, but still running. the room 40 degrees warmer than the corridor outside. The warmth pressing in from the floor and the lower walls, in a way that never let you forget it was coming from below, from something that had been running uninterrupted since before Winterfell had a name. The last mold of the day cooled on the rack to his right. The runes already set, the metal making the small sounds metal made while it solidified. The tick and settle of something moving from one state to another. He pressed his palm flat against the face of the cooling blade. It should have burned. The metal was still above body temperature. He felt nothing uncomfortable. He felt the hum, low and constant, the way a plucked string hummed after the note had gone, the way the weirwood door had hummed when his blood touched it. Not mechanical. Not heat. Something that recognized his hand and responded to it the way a dog responded to a familiar voice. He stood with his hand on the blade for a long time. He had woken that morning thinking about the Song of Ice, the tablets with the deeper carving, the prints of two bloods, the walls first breaking. He had translated that section himself in the rune layer. The words assembling before his eyes had finished reading the shapes, faster than reading should work. The forge glow caught the recessed runes, and for a moment they seemed to move, not rearranging, not shifting, but breathing. The way the heartwood face and the godswood breathed when the wind moved the branches and the light changed. He took his hand off the blade. Somewhere beyond the wall, in the dark that had no floor and the cold that had no ceiling, something moved between trees that had not had leaves in 1,000 years. It did not feel the wind. It did not feel anything that Jon had a name for. He didn't know that yet. He banked the forge and went to bed. He had been watching the servants for 3 days before he decided to follow one. Not all the servants. One specific servant, a young man, 17 at most, who carried covered trays to the kitchen passage at odd hours and returned empty-handed, which was correct and unremarkable, except that the trays went down full and the boy came back too quickly. You could not cross the kitchen passage and return in the time the boy was taking. The kitchen passage connected to the lower castle. The lower castle connected to the crypts. Tyrion had catalogued this the first morning without intending to. It was simply what he did. Read the room, read the people in it, read the gaps between what people carried, and how long it took them. He had spent his adult life developing this particular skill because it was the only skill his body permitted him, and because the alternative was to be perpetually surprised, which was intolerable. He was staying in Winterfell longer than the royal party. This was technically a courtesy, the northernmost point of his journey, a chance to see the wall. A whim Robert had indulged without much scrutiny. The truth was he found Winterfell more interesting than he'd expected, and the truth beneath that truth was he found Ned Stark's recent behavior more interesting than he'd expected, and the truth beneath that was something he hadn't finished naming yet. He gave the servant a 30-second head start. Then, he followed. The passage went down. He had expected that. He had not expected the warmth, which increased with every 10 steps in a way that had nothing to do with torches or hearth fires, a warmth that came from the stone itself, from below, ancient and constant and thoroughly impossible in a northern castle in winter. He followed the warmth as much as the servant. The passage leveled. He came around a corner and stopped. Not the servant. The servant was gone, had apparently turned off somewhere in the dark, or had never been going where Tyrion assumed, or had been a deliberate misdirection he should have recognized. Any of those. Jon Snow was standing in the antechamber at the passage's end with his back to the wall and his arms folded, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for an amount of time he considered appropriate. Tyrion looked at him. Jon looked at Tyrion. "You've been watching the servants for 3 days," Jon said. Not an accusation. A statement of logged fact. Tyrion considered several responses. He chose the one with the most information value. Closer to 4. Jon nodded once. He unfolded his arms and moved to the stone bench along the antechamber wall and sat. He gestured to the opposite bench with the economy of someone who had decided this was going to be a conversation and had already arranged the room for it. Tyrion sat. The warmth pressed in from the walls. He looked at the passage beyond the antechamber, the darkness going further down, and decided not to comment on it. "You've been watching the forge activity," Jon said. "The change in Micken's hours. The northern lords arriving without banners, specific materials going into the lower castle and not coming back out. Among other things, Tyrion said, the ward rotation changed, the training schedules. Jon's eyes moved to Tyrion's face with the attention of someone reading rather than looking, taking in data, processing it. You noticed all of it. It would be difficult not to. For most people, Jon said, it wouldn't be. Tyrion looked at him. The boy was 15. He had the Stark coloring without the Stark height yet, still growing into his frame, still slightly awkward in the shoulders. But his face had that settled quality that some people never achieved. The quality of someone who had already had the conversation with themselves about who they were and reached a conclusion they found acceptable. He was not the boy Tyrion had spoken to on the walls 3 weeks ago. That boy had been sharper-edged, quicker to wound. This one was patient in a way that required practice. You're going to tell me what you've concluded, Tyrion said, and I'm going to listen to whether you're right. Jon said, the forge work is military preparation. The runic element is something your family doesn't have the scholarship to replicate, which means it's not a threat Tywin can neutralize by throwing gold at it. The northern lords are being organized around something specific, not a campaign against the crown, because the positioning is wrong for that. The watch. He paused. Everything points north, not south. Tyrion said nothing. You're right about everything you mentioned, Jon said. The room was very quiet. That was not the response Tyrion had prepared for, and he had prepared for quite a number of responses. He had not prepared for simple confirmation. That's an unusual negotiating position, Tyrion said, confirming what your opponent knows. You're not my opponent. Your father refused the handship. My father is the most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms. The geometry of that situation suggests otherwise. The geometry of that situation, Jon said, is about politics. What's happening in Winterfell isn't about politics. He looked at Tyrion directly. The firelight from the wall sconce caught the gray of his eyes. The stark gray, unambiguous. You know that. You've known it since the forge temperatures changed, and you couldn't find a heat source that accounted for it. Tyrion had, in fact, known it since then. He had spent 3 days building alternative explanations and watching each one fail. He leaned back against the stone wall. What do you want from me, Jon Snow? I want you to make a choice, Jon said. You can tell your father what you've seen. Which is nothing, you haven't seen anything. This is an antechamber and warm stone and a servant with an efficient route. Or, you can decide not to tell him. And if I decide not to tell him, then you've decided that whatever is happening here matters more than what your father wants to know about it. Tyrion looked at him for a moment. He thought about Joffrey at the welcome feast, Joffrey's cruelty, the specific pleasure his nephew had taken in the specific target, the way a hunting hound fixed on a scent. He thought about his own visit to the Night's Watch funding proposal, which Robert had laughed at and Ned had not. He thought about the warmth coming through the stone and the temperature of a forge that had no business reaching the readings Lewin's borrowed gauge had shown. And if I decide it matters, Tyrion said. Jon said, when the real war comes, and it will come, it is coming, it is already closer than anyone south of the Neck believes. The Lannisters are going to need a friend who knew about it before everyone else, not Tywin Lannister. A Lannister. He didn't move, didn't emphasize it, let it sit there the way Ned Stark let things sit, without visible investment in whether they landed. Someone who made the right call when it was still possible to make a wrong one. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. Outside the antechamber, the passage held its warmth. From somewhere further down, not close, but not far enough, he heard nothing, and the nothing had a quality to it, an aliveness, that empty stone passages didn't usually have. You're 15 years old, Tyrion said. I know, Jon said. Tyrion looked at the boy, at the patience in his face that required practice, at the eyes that read rather than looked. He thought about the last conversation he'd had with someone who spoke to him this way. Without the performance of managing him, without the Lannister-shaped space people left around him, compensating for his height and his family simultaneously. He couldn't immediately place when that had been. He stood. I haven't seen anything, Tyrion said. An antechamber. Warm stone. A servant with an efficient route. Jon said nothing. He didn't nod. Didn't acknowledge the decision. He had the sense not to mark it. Tyrion walked back up the passage the way he had come, one hand trailing the warm stone wall, counting the steps back to the junction. He didn't look back. The instructions were specific about snowfall, not preference. Requirement: the communion required precipitation. The library gave no explanation for this, which Lewin had spent 2 days trying to argue around before conceding that some things in the tablets operated as conditions rather than suggestions. Snow or rain. Ideally, snow. The water coming down activated something in the weirwood root network that still air didn't. The way a river moved differently than a lake despite being the same substance. It had snowed every night for a week. The godswood held 4 inches on the ground by the time Ned walked into it at the 2nd hour past midnight. Alone. No torch. He knew the path. 15 years of marriage to this castle, 15 years of pre-dawn hours in this godswood when sleep was unavailable and duty was. The heart tree stood at the center, enormous and pale, its carved face looking the direction it always looked, south, old and red-eyed and patient, with the patience of something that measured time in centuries, and had decided patience was simply accuracy. The weirwood disc from the library was in his left hand, a tablet fragment, not broken off, cut deliberately, circular, palm-sized. The runes on its face different from the archive runes. These were older. Howland had translated them as the relay, for those whose blood is thin. He had said it without judgment. Ned had taken it without protest. He sat between 2 roots that curved above the snow line like the arches of a very old bridge. He pressed his back against the heartwood. The bark was cold, not the cold of stone which held cold without feeling it, but the cold of something alive that was also ancient, that had lived long enough to stop generating warmth the way younger things generated it. He pressed the disc against his forehead. He closed his eyes. For a long time, nothing. The snow came down. He heard it in the branches, that particular soft percussion of flakes on bare wood, the only snow sound quieter than falling itself. He kept his breathing even. He kept his hands still. He did what the library said to do, which was nothing except remain and wait, the way you remained and waited for a hunting animal to forget you were there. Then the godswood went away. Not darkness. Not a dream. The distinction was important, and he understood it immediately. This had the texture of the present, not the texture of something constructed. The sensation was of being in a place, not of watching a place. He was cold in the way cold actually felt, not the way cold felt when you remembered it. The haunted forest. The trees wrong species distribution, wrong spacing. The canopy above showing stars through gaps that shouldn't exist this deep in. The snow on the ground was old, compacted, not the fresh fall of Winterfell's godswood. This had been lying here for days, and beneath it the ground was too hard, frozen too deep, the wrong kind of cold even for this latitude and this season. He was in the eyes of a weirwood. He understood that immediately. The perspective was wrong for a man's height. He was seeing from the tree's face, from the carved eyes in the pale bark, and the field of vision was not human. Wider, less central. The periphery more alive than the center. Something moved between the trees. He counted. He counted the way he counted enemies in a field assessment. Not by looking directly, but by tracking movement in the edges of vision, building the number from motion rather than bodies. He counted to 30 and stopped counting, because the number wasn't going to stop, and he had understood what he needed to understand. They moved without sound. That was the thing. 30 bodies moving through old snow should have made a sound. Should have produced the compressed creak of weight on frozen ground, the brush of passage against deadfall. They made nothing. The forest was as silent with them in it as it had been without them. And they had no warmth. He looked for the heat shimmer that living bodies produced against cold air, not visible exactly, but present. The subtle atmospheric distortion of 30 creatures breathing in freezing temperatures. Nothing. They passed through the air without marking it. They passed through the world without the world noticing them. He counted as high as he could count. He broke the contact. His hands were bleeding. He had gripped the heartwood without realizing it, both hands flat against the bark. And the bark had done what weirwood bark did, what the sealed door had done, what every piece of this tree seemed designed to do with first men blood, it had taken a little. Not much. Thin lines across both palms, already closing. He looked at them in the dark without particular feeling. The snow continued to fall. He sat between the roots for a while longer. Not communing. Just breathing. The godswood was quiet around him in the way it was always quiet, not empty, just attentive, which was a different thing entirely. He went inside. He did not sleep. The raven to the wall went at dawn. Jon encoded it, rune script, the library's cipher, indecipherable without the key. The message itself was 8 words in the old tongue. He watched Jon write it without asking what the words meant. He had told Jon what to say. He trusted that Jon had said it. The reply came 6 days later. 3 words in the same cipher back. Jon translated it at the table in the library. He read it once, set the slip down, and looked at Ned. "I've seen them too," Jon said. The slip sat on the table between them. 3 words from Benjen Stark, First Ranger. A man who rode beyond the wall for a living, and had been doing it for 15 years, and had seen everything the North produced, and had never in 15 years sent a raven that sounded like that. Ned picked the slip up and looked at it. Then he folded it and put it in his belt. He summoned them that night. Howland and Luwin and Jon. The solar, not the library. The maps were here. The canonical Westeros maps that Luwin kept updated, and the library's map on a portable copy that Howland had been rendering for 3 weeks. Both of them side by side on the table. The world as the maesters knew it, and the world as the first men had known it. Ned drew the line without speaking first. Quill on the canonical map. From Eastwatch by the sea in the east, straight west to the Shadow Tower, following the wall's line. He set the quill down. "Everything south of this line is irrelevant," he said. Luwin said, "Lord Stark, the Iron Throne. The Iron Throne is a chair." Luwin, his voice came out level, not harsh, simply the correct temperature for a statement of fact about a chair. "What I saw last night cannot be sat on." Luwin was quiet. His chain shifted. He looked at the line on the map and then at Ned's hands, the thin lines across the palms, mostly healed but still visible. He had not asked about the hands. He was a maester. He had enough medical knowledge to understand what weirwood contact at that pressure produced. He looked at the map again. He did not say anything else about the Iron Throne. Howland stood across the table with his arms folded, looking at the line. He had been looking at it since Ned drew it. His face had that quality of deep water, information beneath, nothing surfacing that he hadn't chosen to surface. "How many?" Howland said. "More than I could count," Ned said. Moving south. No warmth. No sound. Jon had been reading the long night tablets in the corner of the room, on the bench he'd been occupying every evening for 3 weeks. He had been doing it quietly, without comment, the way he did everything in the library methodically, without announcing what he was finding. He looked up now. "It isn't a military campaign," Jon said. Everyone looked at him. The long night tablets. He set down the stylus. "It isn't organized. It doesn't have a target in the way armies have targets. It's a season." He paused, choosing the word with the precision of someone who had been reading for weeks and had found this specific word in the text and not substituted it. A season that lasts a generation. They don't march, they accumulate. The solar was very quiet. "Westeros has been distracted," Jon said, "for 1,000 years, and the cold has been accumulating for all of it." He said it without heat, without the dramatic weight a younger version of himself might have placed on it. He said it the way the tablets had given it to him, flat and complete and slightly too large to fit entirely in one room. Luwin sat down. Jon went to the godswood after. Ned saw him cross the yard from the solar window, moving through the light snowfall toward the trees, no torch, walking the path without needing to think about it. The godswood took him. He sat between the roots where Ned had sat. He pressed his bare hand against the heartwood. Not with the disc. He had left the disc in the library. He didn't have green sight. He had the rune reading and the forge hum and the thing his blood did at weirwood thresholds, and he wasn't sure what category those gifts occupied, or whether the library had a name for someone who had all of them in combination. He closed his eyes. He expected nothing. He had not used the disc. The instructions were specific. He got something anyway. Not a vision. Not the present tense immersive quality Ned had described. A sound. Only a sound. Coming from somewhere north and high and far. From above the tree line in a direction that didn't correspond to any compass point he had a name for. 10,000 wings. Not flying. Not fleeing. The specific sound of birds that had landed somewhere and were waiting. The way ravens waited on the wall's ramparts before a ranging party went out. The patient and terrible stillness of things that knew something was coming. He opened his eyes. The godswood was quiet. The snow had stopped. The carved face of the heart tree looked south with its red eyes, as it always had, as it always would, waiting for something that was finally, after all this time, beginning to arrive. Jon looked north. His breath fogged the air in front of him, and the fog dissolved, and the night beyond the walls of Winterfell was very dark and very large and getting larger. He didn't go back inside for a long time. He counted the sentries before he counted the banners. Old habit. The banners told you who was inside a castle. The sentries told you whether the people inside thought anyone was coming. Two different categories of information, and the second one was always more useful. The sentries at Winterfell's gate were wrong. Not wrong in the way of soldiers who didn't know their business, wrong in the way of soldiers who knew different business than you expected. The positioning was off for a standard watch rotation, off in a specific direction, each man placed where the natural shadow of the wall fell longest at this hour, maximum visibility out, minimum visibility in. Not a courtesy rotation. A tactical one. Men who had been told to watch, not to stand. Their armor caught his eye at 30 yards, not the dull iron of northern plate, not the painted steel of Lannister knights, something darker, amber brown, catching the gray winter light and holding it rather than throwing it back. He had never seen that color in metal. He filed it and rode through the gate with his 200 behind him and his face arranged into the expression that indicated nothing whatsoever. Ned Stark met him in the yard without a cloak on. This was either a northern affectation or a statement. Jaime had ridden 6 weeks north in intermittent snow and was wrapped to the jaw. Ned stood in the cold courtyard in a wool doublet and looked at the column of Lannister knights the way a man looked at something he had been expecting and had already decided what to do about. "Lord Lannister," Ned said. "Welcome to Winterfell." Lord Stark. Jaime swung down from his horse. He was taller than Ned by 2 inches and looked at when they stood together, which was one of the few advantages his body had ever produced in a conversation with the man. "My father sends his regards. Your father is generous," Ned said. Neither of them pursued that. The war game was Ned's suggestion. That was the thing Jaime kept returning to later. Ned had proposed it. Not defensively, not as a demonstration, as a courtesy, the northern equivalent of showing a guest the view from the tower. "This is what we do here. Would you like to see it?" Jaime had 200 knights. Ned had proposed 10 of his own guards against 20 of Jaime's choosing. Jaime had chosen the 20 personally. His best. Men who had trained under him, who understood spacing and formation, and the particular language of coordinated swordwork that took years to develop. He was not going to embarrass himself by sending middling men into a demonstration and being surprised by the result. He chose the 20 and watched them take the field against Ned's 10 and watched what happened. What happened was difficult to describe in the vocabulary he had. Ned's 10 didn't form a line. They didn't form a wedge. They didn't form anything he had a name for. They moved as a system, responsive at a speed that suggested they weren't reacting to each other at all, that suggested they had somehow agreed in advance on what every possible configuration of the exchange would require. The 20 Lannister knights pressed the engagement and found themselves pressing air. Not retreating air. Redirected air. The 10 Winterfell guards were never where they had been a half-second prior, and the places they moved to were precisely the places where the Lannister formation had committed weight. He watched a Lannister knight with 15 years of training and a reputation for intelligent footwork commit a thrust at the guard directly in front of him, and the guard was not directly in front of him, and hadn't been for a quarter second before the commitment was irreversible, and the guard's blunted practice blade caught him across the back of the knee in a way that had no name in Andal. Swordsmanship. No name because Andal's swordsmanship didn't involve knowing where the knee would be before the leg moved. 7 minutes. Jaime stood at the field's edge with his arms folded and watched the last of his 20 concede the touch and step back, and did not allow his face to do anything at all. The 10 Winterfell guards hadn't broken formation once. The solar was warm. The fire was unnecessary warm. Winterfell in winter ran at a temperature that the springs beneath it made possible, and the solar shared in this in a way that made you forget briefly that the world outside was trying to kill you. Ned poured 2 cups and set one in front of Jaime without asking. Northern wine. Not good northern wine, which didn't exist, but wine that had been kept correctly in a cool cellar and was therefore inoffensive. "Where did you find those tactics?" Jaime said. "My family has been in the north a long time," Ned said. Jaime looked at him across the table. He looked at the careful blankness of Ned's face, the blankness that was not absence, but decision, a man choosing what to put there. He had been looking at faces for 30 years and reading them for nearly as long, and Ned Stark's face was the only one he had consistently found unreliable, which was itself a kind of information. "What do you want, Stark?" Not a question. He was too tired for questions. "You've refused the handship. You've politely told Robert that the North has its own concerns. You're training a guard unit that doesn't fight like anything in Westeros, in armor that doesn't look like anything in Westeros. What do you want from the Iron Throne?" Ned said, "Nothing it has." The fire settled. Jaime turned his cup on the table. 1 full rotation. He looked at the wine surface moving and stilling. "Then what?" he said. "Men at the wall," Ned said. "Properly supplied. Consistent resupply, not the discretionary allocations that get cut when the Treasury has other priorities. And Robert's word, his actual word, witnessed that if I summon my bannermen, it is not interpreted in King's Landing as a northern independence movement." Jaime looked at him. "That's all," Ned said. It was the smallest demand Jaime had heard from a lord who had the current leverage to demand considerably more. It was the demand of a man who had something else entirely on his mind and needed the South to stay out of the way while he dealt with it. The understanding arrived slowly. Jaime was not slow. He was the opposite of slow, quick in ways his body expressed and in ways his mind expressed. And the latter had never received appropriate acknowledgement, but this one arrived slowly because it required him to accept something his father had told him, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong about power, was not real. "You're genuinely preparing for them," Jaime said. "Not a question." He heard himself say it, and heard that it was not a question. Ned looked at him across the table with a face that was decision rather than absence. He said, "Aren't you?" Jaime said nothing. He picked up his cup. He rode ahead of the column on the way south, 200 knights behind him, the King's Road running south through a landscape that was uniformly the color of the sky, which was uniformly the color of old iron. He rode ahead because he needed the sound of 1 horse rather than 200, needed to think without the noise of the column's routine filling the spaces between thoughts. He thought about the report he would give his father. The report was not difficult to write in his head. He had the information. The amber breastplates, which he now understood were bronze, and not what bronze was supposed to be. The 10 guards, the 7 minutes, the name he didn't have for what they had done to his 20, the solar and the fire and Ned Stark's face, and the smallest demand a powerful lord had ever made in his hearing. He thought about how his father would read it. Tywin Lannister had built everything he had on the principle that men wanted power, and that understanding what kind of power a specific man wanted was the complete knowledge of that man. Titles, gold, land, legitimacy, revenge, sex, safety for children, these were the categories. Everything fit into one of them. You found the category, you found the price, you conducted the transaction. Ned Stark didn't fit. The demand was too small. The preparation was too genuine. A man performing northern independence didn't ask for wall resupply. He asked for autonomy or trade rights or the return of some ancestral slight. A man performing strength didn't propose a war game he might lose at long odds. he demonstrated the strength he wanted you to know he had. Ned was not performing anything. His father would read the report and find the political explanation, because the political explanation was the only framework Tywin had ever needed. He would categorize this as leverage building, as a northern lord establishing a negotiating position before the southward move. He would be wrong. He would be wrong in a way that would not be apparent until it was too late to be apparent in a useful way. Jaime pulled his cloak tighter. He thought about the guard, the specific guard, the one who had blocked his knight's thrust with the move that had no Andal name. He had watched that exchange from the field's edge, and he had seen something in the guard's footwork that was not improvement on a known technique. It was a different technique. A complete and developed system for a different kind of opponent than Andal training prepared you for. The kind of opponent that didn't fight the way men fought. The night was closing in from the east. The column moved through it. Jaime rode ahead of it and didn't look back at Winterfell, not because he wasn't thinking about it, but because he had already memorized everything worth memorizing, and looking back would only confirm what he already knew. The cold coming down from the north had a quality tonight he hadn't noticed on the way up. It had the quality of something that had been waiting for the column to pass. Roose had sent the invitation 3 weeks ago. The pretense was trade, southern merchants moving through the King's Road, duties that required a lord's arbitration, the kind of administrative necessity that justified summoning a neighboring lord without raising the question of why you wanted him in your hall rather than yours in his. It was a thin pretense. He knew it was thin. He had sent it anyway because thin pretenses extended to men who were not yet suspicious, and Ned Stark, for all his recent strangeness, had not yet identified Roose Bolton as a problem. That was the asset. Roose had spent 40 years cultivating the quality of not being identified as a problem, until the moment identification was no longer useful. The letters to the south had gone through 4 intermediaries. The Lannister response had come back through 5, which told him something about how seriously Tywin was treating the northern question. The extra step meant an extra layer of insulation, which meant the hand that held the letter was more careful than the hand that sent it. Cautious men paid cautious prices. Cautious men also paid promptly, because they understood the cost of accounts left unsettled. The offer had been simple. Ned Stark, secured and delivered south, was worth the Dreadfort's expansion into the Last River territories and a seat on whatever council Tywin was constructing for the post-Baratheon arrangement. Roose did not speculate about timelines. Tywin's arrangements had their own schedule. He stood at the window of his solar, watching the road from the south, his hands folded behind him, his face at rest. His face was always at rest. It had been at rest since he was 6 years old, since he had understood that faces were tools and not expressions, and that tools in constant use wore down faster than tools stored correctly. The column appeared on the road at the 4th hour. 12 men. He counted them twice. 12, not the Lord of Winterfell with a retinue. 12 men in riding formation, compact, no banner. He watched them come down the road with the particular unhurried quality of people who had decided the road was not going to surprise them. Their armor caught the morning light wrong. Roose looked at it for a moment. The color was not right for iron, not right for standard bronze, something between amber and dark honey, something that held light the way still water held it, absorbing rather than reflecting. He had never seen that color in metal. He went downstairs. Jon Snow rode through the Dreadfort's gate with 11 men behind him and Ghost ranging somewhere in the hills to the east, out of sight, which was where Ghost had been since they crested the last rise, and the wolf had gone very still, and then moved wide without Jon telling him to. The yard held 40 men. Roose had arranged them well, not in a line, not in obvious formation. Distributed in the casual positions of men going about their morning with no particular agenda. 40 men with casual positions and hands at rest near their weapons. Jon stopped his horse in the center of the yard. He took his time looking at the distribution. The positions. The hands. He counted the sight lines and the distances and the places where the casual arrangement became a functional one with a single word. He had been doing this since Howland started teaching him, and he did it now without moving his head, reading the yard through his periphery, the way the training had taught him to read terrain. Roose Bolton stood at the far end of the yard with 8 men flanking him. His face was at rest. Jon dismounted. He handed his reins to the rider on his left without looking. He walked across the yard toward Roose with his hands visible and empty, and he stopped at a distance that was close enough for conversation, and far enough that neither of them had to tilt their head. He said, "Lord Bolton." Roose said, "I invited Lord Stark." "Lord Stark sends his regards," Jon said. He thought the matter might be handled more efficiently this way. Roose's eyes moved to the amber breastplate and stayed there for a moment. Then they came back to Jon's face. "You're his bastard," he said. The word was clinical. It carried nothing in it, no contempt, no particular interest, just the taxonomic category. "I'm his blood child," Jon said, "by the right of the old king, invoked before the heart tree, witnessed by Howland Reed." He paused. "You know Howland Reed." Roose said nothing. Jon reached inside his riding cloak. He produced a tablet, not the full weirwood slab, a copy, rendered on prepared skin by Lewin's careful hand, the old tongue script set out in clean rows, with the rune layer transliterated below each line. He held it out. Roose didn't take it immediately. He looked at it. Then, he took it with one hand, slowly, and held it where the morning light could reach the script. "Your ancestral rune is on the 9th line," Jon said. "The compact your first lord swore before the pact was sealed. The specific terms, the specific violations." He let Roose read. He stood with his hands at his sides and waited, watching Roose's face do nothing. "There are 47 other Northern Lords' runes I can show this to. The library has the original record for every house in the north. Yours is the longest entry. The yard was very quiet. 40 men with hands near their weapons, and the yard was completely quiet. Because every one of them was reading the stillness between Roose Bolton and this 15-year-old boy in amber bronze, and trying to understand what the stillness meant." "The library," Roose said. His voice was level. "Bran the Builder's archive," Jon said. "Sealed beneath the crypts, 4,000 years of northern law." He let that sit. "Every violation your house has committed under the guise of war custom is documented. Names, dates, rune witnessed. Readable by any northern lord with old tongue literacy, and there are more of those than you've likely accounted for." Roose looked at the tablet. His face did nothing. His hand, Jon noticed, had moved a degree away from his sword belt, a degree and no more, the smallest possible adjustment in the direction of not reaching. "You have options," Jon said. "The first is the council. Lord Stark convenes the northern lords. This document is presented. Your house is named before every banner in the north simultaneously. The second is the banner." He looked up at the flayed man over the Dreadfort's gate. "It comes down. A new oath is sworn, the original Bolton Compact, the version in the library, which is considerably more binding than anything your house has sworn in the last 3,000 years. And if I choose neither," Roose said. "You won't," Jon said. The yard held its breath. Roose looked at him the way Roose looked at everything, with the flat assessment of a man who had made a study of calculating correctly and found most calculations straightforward. He was making this one now. Jon could see him making it. The 40 men and the 12. The document in his hand, the library beneath Winterfell that he had not known, existed and could not now unknow. The Lannister correspondence that would mean considerably less if his house was publicly named before the Northern Lords. "You're 15, Roose said. "I know," Jon said. Roose handed the tablet back. His face was at rest. It had been at rest the entire time, and it remained at rest now, which was somehow more unsettling than any expression it might have produced. "I will swear the old oath," Roose said. "I know," Jon said. The flayed man came down at dusk. No ceremony. A servant climbed the gate with a pole hook and worked the banner loose from its bracket with the efficient, unhurried motion of a man completing a task he had been told to complete. It came down in a fold. The servant tucked it under his arm and walked back inside. A plain gray banner went up. No sigil. No device. The original Bolton colors, before the Andals brought their heraldry north and the Boltons adopted a sigil that broadcast, to anyone who read it correctly, exactly what they were. Jon stood outside the Dreadfort walls and watched the gray banner catch the evening wind. Ghost came out of the hills at full run, moving low and fast, and stopped at Jon's side. The wolf was not distressed, he carried no alarm in his body. But his muzzle was working, reading something on his coat that he brought with him from the hills. Jon crouched beside him. He pressed his face briefly against Ghost's neck, not for comfort, to smell what Ghost had brought back. The wolf's fur carried the specific combination of horse sweat and tallow and something sharper, something mineral and expensive that Jon had encountered before. Lannister armor oil. The specific blend the Lannister smiths used on their plate, different from northern practice. A Casterly rock recipe that had no equivalent this far north. Someone had been in the hills east of the Dreadfort. Watching the road, watching the column arrive, watching the banner come down, Jon stood up. He looked at the hills, the line of them going dark against the evening sky, the empty ridgeline where empty ridgelines had no business being quite so carefully empty. The message was already south, not the content, they hadn't been close enough for content, but the fact of it, 12 men arriving, 40 men watching, a banner coming down at dusk without a word of conflict. Tywin Lannister would receive that information in 10 days. He would spend another 10 trying to understand what it meant. He would construct an explanation from the political framework he had, which was the only framework he had, and the explanation would be wrong in a way that would not be apparent until the wrong moment. Jon looked at the gray banner over the Dreadfort gate. The wind moved it once. It settled. He turned south and did not look at the hills again. Ghost walked beside him, close, the wolf's shoulder warm against his leg in the cooling air. Somewhere ahead, the road ran back to Winterfell and everything waiting in it. Somewhere behind, in the hills that were now empty, a rider was already pushing south with a report that described everything correctly and explained nothing at all. Jon walked, and the dark came down around him, and the Dreadfort's gray banner disappeared into it. The cloak was the first thing he noticed. He had seen every piece of clothing Ned Stark owned. 15 years of proximity produced that kind of knowledge. The gray wool doublet for receiving guests, the riding leathers for ranging, the formal house colors for occasions that required them. He knew his father's wardrobe the way he knew the crypts, by feel and repetition and the particular associations each item carried. The cloak on Ned's shoulders was none of those. Black, where Stark formal wear ran to gray. A direwolf on the back, not the current house rendering, not the clean-lined animal on the Winterfell banners. This one was older. The stitching carried gold thread in a weight and style that nobody in the north currently used, a technique the library had documented as pre-Andal in its textile records. The cloak had come from the sealed wardrobe in the archive's furthest corner, wrapped in weirwood cloth, preserved by 4,000 years of dry heat in First Men's sealing. Ned stood at the front of the great hall, and the cloak fell from his shoulders to the floor, and the Northern Lords looked at it the way the Northern Lords looked at everything, without expression, reading it completely. Every seat was filled, Mormont with his stone face and his sword across his knees, great Jon Umber taking up the space of 2 men at the far table, his fist resting on the wood. The Manderly envoy, a man Manderly trusted with his life, which in practice meant trusted with his decisions. Flint and Little side by side, the way they had ridden to Winterfell and the way they would ride back. The reeds in the corner like gray water, Howland's face unreadable as always, his hands folded in his lap. Ned let the silence run for a moment. He didn't fill it. Then he laid it out. Not the library. The library remained below, remained sealed, remained the North's. What he gave them was what he had given them separately, privately. In the weeks before, the runic bronze and what it did against Castle forged steel, the Night's Watch evidence and the house it implicated, and one thing he had not given them before. He gave them the Song of Ice. The tablets with the deeper carving, the prints of 2 bloods, the walls first breaking, the words that Jon had translated and Ned had read 6 times and said nothing about for 3 weeks. He didn't explain it. He let them read Lewin's transcription, passing it hand to hand around the table, and he watched their faces do what northern faces did with information they couldn't immediately categorize, which was nothing visible and a great deal invisible. Great Jon Umber put the transcription down. The king in the north, he said. Not a ceremony. Not a performance. The Umber said it the way the Umber said everything. at volume, without ornament, the words doing the full work themselves. The Manderley envoy said it next, then Flint, then Little, then Mormont without inflection, the way Mormont accepted necessary facts. The reed said nothing, but Howland inclined his head, and that served. Ned received it without expression, without the shine of a man who had wanted this, without the weight of a man burdened by it. He stood in the old cloak and received it, and that was all. Jon's revelation came between the roast and the wine, in the flat voice Ned used for things he had rehearsed too many times to deliver any other way. Jon's mother was a woman of royal blood, Ned said. He was addressing the table, not Jon specifically, though Jon was at the table, 3 seats down. Of a house that no longer rules. Under First Men law, the father's name carries what it carries. What matters is the blood. Jon carries in his veins a bloodline that the Song of Ice identifies as essential. He paused. That is all you need to know. The table absorbed it. Jon felt eyes move to him and move away, the particular northern discretion of men who had processed information and were already working forward from it, rather than sitting in it. He kept his face level. He had known this was coming. He had not known it would feel like this, not exposure exactly, not the bastard shame he had grown up alongside. Something larger. The feeling of a door opening into a room with no ceiling. Great Jon Umber looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the Weirwood tablet transcription on the table. Then he picked up his cup. The meal continued. The hall emptied in stages, the way northern halls emptied, without ceremony, lords and envoys departing to their assigned chambers, with the efficiency of men who had long rides ahead of them in the morning. Jon stayed at the table until only Howland remained in the far corner. Still as standing water, waiting, Ned said Jon. They went to the solar. Howland closed the door. He stood at it with his back against the wood, not guarding it, simply placing himself where he had decided to be. Ned sat. He looked at Jon across the table, and his hands were flat on the wood, the thin heeled lines across both palms visible in the firelight. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this too, and found the rehearsal insufficient, and had decided to proceed anyway. Your mother's name was Lyanna, Ned said. Lyanna Stark. My sister. Jon was still. She didn't die of a fever. Ned's voice came out level and continued level for everything that followed, because this was the version of Ned the library had made. Not the man who couldn't say things because they cost too much, but the man who said them because the cost of not saying them had finally exceeded the cost of saying them. She died at the Tower of Joy, in Dorne, 3 days after you were born. She bled out. I was with her. She made me promise to keep you safe, and I understood what she meant by safe, and I kept that promise the only way I could. Jon looked at the fire. Your father's name was Rhaegar Targaryen, Ned said. The Crown Prince. He and Lyanna married in secret before a septon, before witnesses, before the war began. It wasn't what Robert told the realm it was. She went willingly. She loved him, and he loved her, and the consequence of that love was a war that killed 30,000 people and a child who was born with no safe name in the world I had left. The fire shifted. A log settling. Ned reached into his doublet. He set something on the table between them. A medallion on a cord, silver, worked in an Associ style. The kind of ornament that had traveled a long way from wherever it was made. Jon looked at it without touching it. She was wearing it when I found her, Ned said. Howland has kept it since 283 AC. He paused. It's yours. Jon looked at the medallion for a long time. He thought about the Song of Ice tablets, the Prince of Two Bloods. The words he had translated himself, in the rune layer, faster than reading worked, the shapes assembling before his eyes had finished moving. He thought about the forge hum and the weirwood door, and the sound of 10,000 wings from somewhere north and high and far. He picked the medallion up. He held it in his palm. The silver was cold, and then it was warm, and he folded his hand around it. Does it change what we're doing? He said. Ned said no. Then it doesn't matter yet, Jon said. He put the medallion in his belt pouch. He closed the pouch. He looked at his father, at Ned Stark, who had carried this for 15 years in the only way available to him, and had never once put it down, and he found that he had nothing to say that the silence didn't say better. He stood. He went to the door. Howland moved aside. The walls of Winterfell were cold the way the walls were always cold, stone that had absorbed 15 winters and gave none of them back. Jon stood on the parapet above the main gate and looked north. Not at the wall, not at the darkness between here and there, just north, in the general direction of everything the library had given him language for, and the Night's Watch had given his uncle language for, and the Long Night tablets had given the world language for, 10,000 years ago, before the world decided to forget. Ghost came up the stairs behind him. Jon heard the wolf's claws on stone, and didn't turn. Ghost pressed against his leg, warm and heavy and present, and stood with him looking north. Jon closed his eyes. He reached, the way he had been practicing in the Godswood every night for 3 weeks, the slow extension of something that lived in the First Men blood, the thing that read runes before the eyes finished moving, the thing that had opened the weirwood door with a drop of blood and a hand pressed flat. He reached for the tree network, the weirwood eyes scattered across the hundreds of miles of frozen ground between Winterfell and the wall and beyond it. He found them one by one, not entering, not seeing through them, just locating them, the way you located lights in a dark room, there and there and there. A string of cold and patient awareness running north through the dark. He counted the trees. From somewhere very far north, beyond the wall, beyond the haunted forest, beyond the place where the map stopped and the library's oldest tablets began, something else arrived. Not the trees. Not the old gods in the way the old gods had always been present. Something older than the trees and colder than the ground they grew from, and it did not announce itself, and it did not threaten, and it did nothing except recognize that he was there, that the North had someone who could reach this far and feel this clearly, that the North was awake. Jon opened his eyes, his breath fogged and dissolved in the air in front of him. Ghost's fur was standing along his spine, not in fear, in the way fur stood when the body registered something the mind was still catching up to. Above them, from the direction of the glass gardens, a single raven lifted and circled, and was joined by another. Then more, rising from the castle's eaves and the towers and the old walls, black against the black sky, climbing without urgency, without alarm. Not flying away, not fleeing, circling in the way birds circled something they intended to stay near, gathering into a number that kept adding to itself until the sky above Winterfell was moving. Waiting, Jon watched them for a long time. Ghost leaned against his leg. The ravens circled. The north was cold and full of whispers, and for the first time in 10,000 years. Winterfell was ready to answer them. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.